Welcome everyone to our first live webinar for 2019. My name is Aneta Bajta and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Argos Multilingual. So I'm joined today by Catherine Brown Hoekstra, so also known as Kit for short, who will be presenting today's topic, 5 strategies for creating global ready content. So for today's webinar, we'll start off with Kit's presentation, and at the end of the presentation we'll have some time for Q&A. Kit will also have a few poll questions, so feel free to join in and answer the polls that she has. And any questions you can submit throughout the webinar in the Q&A option that you guys have on your panel. At the end of the webinar, I will also be sending a link to the recording and also to Kit's slides. So probably in the next day or so, you guys will get that. So without further ado, I'll start by introducing our speaker today. So Kit is an STC fellow and former STC Society president, a certified trainer for the STC Certified Professional Technical Communicator Program, a member of the Colorado State University Media Hall of Fame for the Department of Journalism, and a 2017 Toastmasters District 26 Communication and Leadership Award recipient. She's an experienced consultant with over 25 years of experience in technical communication, much of it working with life sciences companies and localization teams. As principal of ComGenesis, Kit provides consulting and training to her clients on a variety of topics, including localization, content strategy, and content management. She speaks at conferences worldwide and publishes regularly in industry magazines. She co-authored a book on managing virtual teams and recently edited the language of localization for the Content Wrangler and XML Press. So I hope you will all enjoy today's webinar, and I will now pass the mic to Kit.
Great, thanks, Aneta. Let me just share my screen here and make sure that it didn't mute me when I did that. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great introduction. I'm glad you're here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about 5 things you can do to make your content more global ready. Don't need to reintroduce myself because Aneta did a great job. So we're going to talk about, I always like to define terms because when we are when we're talking to a varied audience, a lot of times people have come to the presentation with different ideas. So just making sure that we have the same idea about things. Talking about how to plan for the future, building a structure, managing change, and watching your language and excellence in communication. What does that look like? So, So before I go to the start of the definition, how many languages do you localize into? So if you want to answer that, that would be great. I'll give you a couple minutes, or a couple seconds, I should say. So 0 to 5, 6 to 10, more than 10. Biggest pain point? Oh, you guys all answered all 3 of them. Great. So 100%, oh, most of you are more than 10. Some of you are 0 to 5. Good. Interesting that there's no middle there. Yes, in-country reviews. That's like one of the biggest problems, I think, with localization. I think every company struggles with this. Content management systems, translation quality is also a big deal. And we'll talk about some things that you can do in the source content that will help you improve your translation quality, because localization, as you know, is a garbage in, garbage out process. Most of you are not yet doing structured, and most of you are not yet working in a CMS. So those are 2 things that we're going to talk about as ways to improve your localization and global readiness. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now, and I don't know if you can, oh, here, I can share the results. Look at that. This is the first time I've used the polling process. So most of you are in 0 to 5, a few are in 6 to 10, and more than 10 is about a third of you. So translation quality, most of the things that relate to translation quality are somewhat in your control by working on the source content. We're going to talk about that today. Not doing structured, most of you are not doing structured, most of you are not yet in a CMS. So, okay, great. That's good to know. And that'll help with me directing some of the discussion for today. So what is global ready content? Global ready content is active voice, it's consistent, it's culturally neutral. So one of the goals with the source content is to make it as culturally neutral as possible so that localization becomes easier and more effective. It's simple, it's structured, it's well written and well edited. So basically take the principles of good technical communication and apply those rigorously to your content, and you're really you're about halfway there, okay? And then we're gonna talk about what we do, you know, what are the things that you can do to make it, hang on one second, I've got, there we go. So the first thing that you need to do is make your content future ready. You need to plan for the future. And by doing that and designing with the world in mind, so even if you aren't currently localizing, but you're thinking about it, if you're designing your products and your content with the idea that somebody else somewhere else in the world might be using it someday, you're going to be a lot further along, because it's a lot easier to design it right the first time than it is to retrofit it later. If your company has a website, you are potentially a global company, because anybody in the world could potentially find you on the web. So here are some things that you can do to plan. First thing is content strategy. The language of content strategy defines content strategy as the analysis and planning required to develop a repeatable system that governs the management of content throughout the content lifecycle. So what this means is you have to look at your content holistically, and that includes localization. Ideally, your localization process should not be separate from your overall content strategy, from your overall content development system and process, because it's part of creating a global product. It's part of selling your product and services globally. And your strategy and your architecture should facilitate and support localization. And you do that by making it part of that strategy. So information architecture and design. The Language of Content Strategy is a great book, by the way, available on Amazon or from XML Press, because it has a lot of definitions of things that we use on a day-to-day basis, terminology that we use on a day-to-day basis. It's an effort to make the terminology more consistent across genres and across industries. So it describes information architecture as the art and science of structuring content to support findability, usability, and usefulness. So information architecture is basically the technical side of that content strategy, and it's what allows you to actually implement your strategy effectively. So if you only remember one thing from today, make sure it says, and I said it earlier, design with the world in mind. And that means making sure that all your structures, processes, content models, all support and facilitate both source content development and localization. And I'm including visual content in this. So you need to look at the whole content ecosystem and define your structures in a way that allows your content to be intelligent, and also supports localization. So you build a structure. When you're structuring your content or your architecture, one of the mistakes that people make when they're first doing this is that they make it too heavy. You don't want it to collapse under its own weight or make it so difficult to maintain that you end up working around it. The whole point of an architecture and a solid structure is to make it flexible but solid. You don't want it to get blown away by the first problem that arises, so you want to kind of think through what might come up. But you don't want it to be so heavy and bloated that it's impossible for your team to maintain either. So the way that you do that is with some requirements analysis. So you think about, how does your workflow support multiple users, meaning multiple content developers, authors, subject matter expert? How do you incorporate review? How do you incorporate localization? You know, all the players, all the stakeholders who need access to your content, how does your workflow support them? Does it support status tracking, version control? That's really becomes super important when you're talking about localization, because again, garbage in, garbage out. If you send the wrong version to localization, that's what's going to get localized. And then if you don't notice that and you've localized into 50 languages, all of a sudden you've spent thousands of dollars unnecessarily. You also need to think about how it supports multiple output formats, including output formats that you don't today provide. So you've got to plan for the future. So right now you might only be doing PDF, web, online help, but what about augmented and virtual reality, or chatbots, or AI components? You need to think about, you know, how does it look on your mobile device versus your computer screen? You know, so think about how those multiple output formats work and how you can efficiently do the single sourcing that you need to do to provide the content in the right format at the right time to the right people, which is the holy grail, right? You need to look at, how does your process support localization? How does it support content chunking, content modularization? Those are all things that you need to think about as you're doing a requirements analysis on your content management. The content modeling. So when you are thinking about localization, if you're still sending the whole document over to localization, throwing it over the wall, magic occurs and localized versions come back, you're probably spending a lot more on localization than you need to. And the way that you stop doing that is by structuring your content, by chunking components, modules, whatever you want to call it, that allows you to send only the untranslated content to the vendor, while still providing context for the translator. So you can save, by just doing this batching process, you can save 10% or more on your localization costs, because vendors have to charge you for even 100% matches if you are sending it over, because the human translator still has to do context verification. So if you send only new or modified content, that kind of eliminates that process. Really difficult to do if you don't have a content management system. Managing this, you know, thousands of components and modules manually becomes really challenging. So reuse facilitates consistency. So and also on the source content side, reduces your liability. So particularly with regulated content. So if you are, I like to use notes, cautions, and warnings as an example, because they appear everywhere. They appear on labeling, on the machines themselves, or on the in the software itself. They appear in the documentation. They might appear in the support content. They might appear in troubleshooting. So you, it's critically important to write those the same way, so that it's reuse. You write it once and you reuse it over and over again. Same thing with graphics, tables, regulatory information, other content that's used in multiple places. So by doing some modeling and a content audit, you can identify opportunities for reuse and for single sourcing. And again, it's a lot easier to single source if you're using structured authoring in a content management system. One thing that's really important, though, is that consistency does not equal quality. Let me say that again. Consistency does not equal quality. So you need to spend some time also internationalizing the content to ensure that it's clear, concise, and accurate. But that's a whole, I could spend days talking just about that part of the process. This is just intended to give you a high-level overview of some areas that you want to look at. So Yves Sauverall created a book called XML Internationalization and Localization. Anne Rockley wrote a book called Managing Enterprise Content. And Megan Casey has a book called The Content Strategy Toolkit. So these are all really good resources for exploring and diving into the whole structured authoring, intelligent content, theory and practice. So one of the ways that you make your content intelligent is by structuring it well. That means that it needs to be small enough chunks or modules to allow flexibility and big enough to allow context. So writing for structured authoring is a whole workshop by itself, but it requires you to get away from the book paradigm and think in terms of discrete content chunks that are self-contained and reusable without modification. The whole goal of single sourcing is to reuse content without modification. And so, or with minimal modification, right? And what that does is it also makes your localization process more streamlined as well. Another part of content intelligence is making sure that the tagging in the structure makes sense. One easy way to get to structured authoring with technical documentation, particularly, is with DITA, because that's an XML architecture that was developed by IBM and specifically for technical documentation. It's now owned by Oasis, and so it's open source. The DITA Open Toolkit is a place to explore. But I would start with these higher level books that I just mentioned before diving directly into DITA, because there are some complexities and nuances of DITA that can make a difference in how you set things up, and if you don't do it right, it can really screw up your localization process. So think about how you can get to structured authoring, and again, start with the requirements. Before you pick a tool, always do the requirements analysis and identify what is your business goal, what are your pain points, what are your requirements. Good metadata is the key to happiness in content management and intelligent content, because this is what allows you to find, manage, and use your content. When you add localization, suddenly you need to think about which metadata needs to be translated and how you're going to expose that metadata to the translators. So make this the second thing that you remember. The first thing was design with the world in mind. The second thing to remember is hard-coded strings are bad. Metadata needs to be stored in a way that you can easily identify and extract the strings that need to be localized, okay? And metadata is, again, a whole, there are people who specialize just in creating taxonomies and ontologies and metadata and terminology for structured content. So that's a whole nother discipline and things like that, but it's something that you should know about. There is a specification called the Dublin Core that can give you, what the basic requirements are for metadata in using it well. Okay, so but I cannot emphasize enough that if you have crappy metadata, you will not have good structured content, and you will not have a good content. You will not be able to implement your content model as effectively, and your writers and your editors and your subject matter experts will have a hard time finding the content that already exists in your system. So metadata is really a foundational thing to structured content. Managing change, both the human kind and the technical kind. The biggest reason for content strategies and content management systems to fail is poor change management. Okay? If you're making changes to source content that is currently being localized, you are costing the company money and time, especially if that change is not vital. And yes, I know everyone thinks their change has to be done right now, but they are wrong. So you need to plan, when you involve localization, you need to really think about where in the process is that particular piece of content, where in the localization process before you start modifying it. Has it already been localized? And if so, then you need to think about how, whether this is a good time to do that, or whether you should wait until the next release or whatever. Bug tracking databases can help with the change management, but most change management systems have a rating scale of some kind to prioritize changes. Level 1 changes are critical changes that must be incorporated into the product before distribution. For example, adding a safety guard to a movable part to prevent injury. You have to make this change or somebody will be hurt or killed, or equipment will be damaged. These are the danger, warning, and caution type activities. Failure to make these changes can result in legal action against the company and that kind of thing, as well as people getting hurt and stuff. So there are big consequences to not making those changes. Level 2 changes are important to make a change to fix a problem. For example, the procedure, oh, excuse me. I'm getting over a little cold, so. It's important to make the change to fix a problem. For example, the procedure for installing the software is missing a critical step that could prevent users from configuring it properly. A graphic showing a machine part uses the old design and not the radically updated one that contains the new features. Those kinds of mistakes that can happen and hopefully get caught in your QA and editorial process. Which in addition to your metadata and your change management, your editorial and QA process is probably the most critical process in managing your content for localization. So level 3 changes, it's helpful to make the change because it improves usability, usefulness, or clarity. So the overview for procedures is missing a materials list. It doesn't prevent the user from performing the procedure, but improving it would make the procedure more useful by telling the user ahead of time what tools they need to perform the task. And level 4 changes are what I call the pretty things. The cosmetic change doesn't affect salability or effectiveness. For example, resizing the logo on the product's cover. And yes, I've had people do that a week before product release. It's a nice to make change that improves aesthetics, but it fixes a minor typo, but it doesn't really add anything. So early in the process, you might be in the design and development process, you might be willing to make all of those levels of change. As you move through the process, as the content gets more stable, as it starts getting sent to localization, you need to really think about whether or not even a level 2 change is important, because in the traditional localization process, desktop publishing is probably 50% of the localization cost. If you make a change when the content is in the desktop publishing or localization engineering phase, what you're doing is taking that content and moving it all the way back through the localization process, because now somebody has to go and verify whether or not that change affects the translation, which in some cases it might not, but they still have to check it. And then it has to go back through the localization QA back into, back into desktop publishing. And then you're basically restarting that whole process for that piece of content. And, when you're trying to get a product out to the market, every day that you have to move that back through the process is costing you more money. It's costing you potentially sales and market share in that market, in that particular market. And then you multiply that by 20 languages or 10 languages. That cost adds up very, very quickly. So by pulling this change management upstream, you're helping your customers by having better quality content to start with, and you're saving money on localization by not redoing things that have already been done. And if a piece of content has already been translated in a previous release, you really need to think whether level 3 or level 4 changes are appropriate for that content, because once you don't want to have to send it back through localization for a preferential change. And we'll get into why sometimes changes in the source language don't affect translation, but again, why you have to check it, okay, in a second. So watch your language. So English is a difficult and confusing language, even for native speakers. We have homonyms, we have false friends, the grammar is inconsistent and often has more exceptions than rules. And then there's just the fact that English doesn't just borrow from other languages, it drags them down dark alleys, knocks them over the head, and rifles their pocket for loose grammar and vocabulary. 70% of our vocabulary is from the French, thanks to the Norman invasion of England in the 11th century. And even though English is a Germanic language and in structure very similar to Dutch, but we borrow from other languages, from abacus to zeitgeist, right, which are considered English words, but they came from Latin and German, right? So, excuse me, this statistic includes all words, jargon, idioms, variations of a word, neologisms, etc. The reality is that most dictionaries contain 200 to 250,000 English words that are used most commonly. The complete Oxford English Dictionary contains about 600,000 words. A recent Google Harvard study validated this number, by the way. Interestingly, the Simplified Technical English Standard uses Merriam-Webster as its reference dictionary, which is one of the ones that contains about 250,000 English words, and is based on American English, which is a key thing to remember. And if you don't know what Simplified Technical English is, we'll talk about that in a second. A bit of trivia. The Webster's Dictionary was created 100 years before the Oxford English Dictionary and was designed to standardize spellings. However, the Oxford English Dictionary is a better dictionary because it provides the etymology of the words, and the definitions are less tautological, meaning they don't use the word to define the word. There's a really great book called The Professor and the Madman, which is a true story about the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary. And it has murder, intrigue, all the great stuff of a mystery novel. So if you're interested, that would be a fun book to read. It's a quick read. So one reason for text expansion is that depending on whom you ask, other languages have far fewer words. And this is the reason that internationalization, terminology management, and controlled language are necessary. One word in English might not have an equivalent word in another language. So you have to describe the concept, which takes up more space. And, you know, many people say that you cannot fully appreciate another culture unless you understand the language. So even though other languages have fewer words, there are many words in other languages that don't translate exactly into English either. The Meaning of Tingo is a great book that talks about these quirky words in other languages that don't have equivalents in English. There's one, and I can't pronounce it but it's like 10 syllables long, and it's from a Tierra del Fuegan language that means that look when you like somebody and they like you back, and they have a word for that. And these kind of words, the words that we have in our language, especially words that have multiple definitions depending on context, tell you what's important to a culture. So, and also help you communicate more effectively, especially with your marketing content, right? So with technical content, we try to strip out the cultural and make it as culturally neutral as possible. That's a little more challenging with marketing content because the way you connect with a market is by understanding them and what's important to them. And so there are some things that you need to think about with marketing content as well, that by doing some creative briefs and stuff like that, and maybe considering transcreation instead of localization. Transcreation basically means taking the idea that's in the source, but using something that's culturally appropriate, a culturally appropriate equivalent, and it's not the same as localization. It's more recreating it for that market. And of course is more expensive, but especially with marketing content, it becomes a little bit more challenging because you want to go towards what is meaningful. You want to get to that emotional thing. So controlled language can reduce your text size by 30% and also make it more clear. The other thing that controlled language and simplified technical English is a flavor of controlled language. So if you're interested in learning more about it, the ASD STE 100 specification, in the front part, it kind of talks about the philosophy and some practical things that you can do to make your content more controlled. And then it also has a dictionary of the things. Now, keep in mind that that particular specification was originally designed for the aeronautics industry, so some of the terminology used in the dictionary might not be appropriate for your particular industry, but it gives you a place to start. We become writers because we love words. We become technical communicators because we want to actually make a decent living. So as technical communicators, your job is to make the information accessible to others, and it's not for showing off your vocabulary. So if you want to do that, write a novel, a poem, literary analysis in your free time. But when you're writing for non-native English speakers, which is most of the world, by the way, you need to use the simplest term that will do the job. And what that means a lot of times when you go to controlled language is that you sacrifice some precision for accurate enough, okay? So you use a controlled, consistent vocabulary in the simplest verb that conveys your meaning. So if you think about this, if I don't know a technical term, I can figure it out from the context if the verb is clear. But if I don't know the verb, I'll never understand the sentence. So let's think about that. Why are verbs so key? So when you were learning another language, what were the first words that you learned? Right? Think about that. I am, I have, I want, I need, I give, right? What is your 2-year-old saying? Me do it. Their grammar isn't correct, but you know exactly what they want, right? So they learn those 5 verbs. They learn who, what, when, where, why, how, no, yes, right? And a few vocabulary words. They can get their basic needs met. Vocabulary is great, but if you don't know that verb, good luck figuring it out. And that's why controlled language is so strict about verb management. And you really need to think about whether or not the verbs that you are using in your content are making it easier or harder for your user to understand what you're talking about. Excuse me. So being excellent, what does that mean? In everything you do, no matter how small, do your best and do excellent work. Okay? I know this is counter to the way a lot of companies suggest, you know, and it's like good enough, just get it out. But localization is a garbage in, garbage out process. And if you have crappy source content, you're gonna have crappy localized content. And those issues will not only increase your costs, they'll increase your liability, decrease usability, decrease usefulness, and customer satisfaction. So you need to make sure that your source content is as error-free as possible and as high quality as possible within the project constraints. So this is where an effective QA process really comes in. And if you're in the habit of excellence and you have good QA, you improve your chances of having quality localized content. So, questions? Thanks very much for your time. And also, here's my contact information.
Kit, we have a couple of questions.
Great.
Yep. So I will bring up my screen maybe. Okay, 1 second. All right, you're gonna have to stop sharing your screen. Sorry, Kit, and then I'll bring up my screen.
Oh, right. Yeah, let me see. How do I? Okay, here it is. Stop share. There we go.
Perfect. Okie dokie. And let me just bring up. Okay. Share screens. Okay. Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much, Kit, for today's webinar. So now we've got a few questions that we'll go through. So the first one is, CMS is usually associated with web content. So here you advocate using CMS for all content, whether offline or online. Wouldn't this necessitate the DAM also?
So I think if you come from a marketing background, that's true. But there are CMSs that are specifically designed for technical documentation and technical content and component-based CCMS. So the web, because it's sexier and more public-facing, tends to get a bigger, a bigger share of the attention and the budget. But having a content management system in your tech doc team is not only possible, it's recommended. And if you are structuring your content as modules, I think it depends on how you're storing your content. So if you have a component-based content management system, it kind of provides your digital asset management.
you should, now some, depending on the content management system, some of them have ways of managing your graphics library and some don't. So you may need a digital asset management system for your graphic library. You know, a lot of companies use like, you know, and I don't want to recommend any particular content management system because there are hundreds out there, and the right one for you has to do with what your requirements are, right? So I think even though the web-based content management systems are more famous, there are a lot of them out there that are specific for technical communication, for e-learning content, for other types of content. And yes, I'm advocating using a CMS for most content. I don't want to say all, because there are situations where it might not make sense. But I would say if there's more than 2 writers, you're localizing into more than 1 language, and you have a volume, you know, and there are different levels of content management system. There are enterprise level, and then there are also ones that are more intended for small teams. So, but if you're currently localizing, or you're planning to localize, if you're doing multi-channel publishing, so you're producing content for the web, for tech docs, for knowledge base, for mobile, online help, manuals, that kind of stuff, you really want to have that. So call outs on illustrations. Number call outs. So you can say, so if you have full text in your graphics, and this is the caveat, and those graphics are not SVG, which means that where the text is actually extractable into the translation memory database, then you are costing your, and the design is not designed to accommodate text expansion, you are costing the company thousands and thousands of dollars. So if one graphic takes $100 to build for the source content, and they have to and you're translating into 50 languages, that one graphic then becomes $5,000 because you have to recreate it for every language. If you design your graphic with numbered call out, and I recommend numbers because not every language uses letters, but every language uses numbers. So numbered call outs in a legend table, you are, one, decluttering your graphics so you don't have to recreate it for every language. 2, you are exposing that text to the translation memory system database so that it can be ensured that the terminology is consistent between the graphics and the text. And 3, you're making that graphic more reusable because there maybe you're highlighting a particular thing on that graphic for this particular use, but maybe you're not, maybe you want to do it differently, use it in a different way somewhere else. So I typically recommend numbered callouts in a legend table. Now, obviously, when you're doing like process or workflow diagram, that's harder. But if you save it as an SVG, then that text becomes extractable. And if you design with text expansion in mind, then you don't have to redesign it for for each language. So next question. Investing in a CMS is an expensive exercise. How can I justify the cost to my management? Part of building the business case is answer the question, what business problem am I trying to solve? Where are my pain points in the content development and localization process? Okay. What things do I need, basically doing that requirements analysis. So the way that you justify that cost is that having a content management system in place, when it's implemented correctly, and that's a big caveat, and thought through before you actually implement it, and that you make sure that your change management and your quality control processes and your review processes are in good shape before you go into a content management system. Because what happens is, if you don't have those good processes, you don't have repeatable processes on the front end, implementing a CMS is not going to solve those problems, because your problem isn't technology, it's people. Okay? So, or the process itself. So taking a really good look at those things can help you. One, it'll help you figure out what content management system from the hundreds that are out there will work for you. And it will help you implement it more effectively by being able to map your current process to where you need to be with your process. But having a content management system that's implemented well gives you several things. One, it allows you to get better control over your content governance. So you can, know when it's time to archive things, and know when it makes your content more intelligent if it's also structured. So it allows you to be future ready. So, okay, maybe you're only doing web and manuals right now, or web and online help right now, but you know that you need to go to mobile, because you've done a poll, for example, and your users are using mobile. It allows you to expand your output formats relatively inexpensively, right? If you, again, with the caveat, if you designed your structure correctly and your content model correctly. It allows you to manage your localization process on a more streaming, most companies are going to a more agile process. So it allows you to keep that flow going to localization more effectively because you'll know exactly where your content is in the process. It allows you to improve your in-country review process and your subject matter review process by automating and improving that notification. So there are a lot of things that go into that, and I'm just talking in general terms. What you need to do is look at what are the problems that you have right now. How will that solve? How will this make you more efficient? So you need to look at the soft costs of how many hours are you spending looking for things, that you could reduce that cost by 10%. You've saved potentially thousands of dollars. You look at the hard costs of localization costs, of content development, product development costs. You look at the time to market cost, right? If it's taking you, 12 weeks to get a new feature out the door, mostly because of localization and content development, maybe you can reduce that by having a content management system where you're able to be refined and do more single sourcing, getting more reuse, making your content more consistent reduces your liability. So those are all areas where you, and if it's regulated content, it makes your content more traceable at a finer level of granularity. So those are the things. We have multiple technical writers that I'm assuming that you meant that all don't write the same way. So how can we get them to write the same way? Your editorial QA process, your style guide, all of those things are hugely important. And terminology management is hugely important. Most localization companies are far ahead of documentation teams on terminology management. In my experience, unless you have started the process of going to controlled language, or unless somebody in marketing has decided to hire a terminologist, most of the time the tech writer has a spreadsheet on their desktop computer that they keep track of within their own writing, but maybe the rest of the team doesn't have access to it. And if you also have an outdated style guide or one that isn't accessible to everyone, and you don't have somebody who's kind of the style police helping make everything consistent and coaching people on that, it makes it really hard. When you go to if you go to controlled language, there are tools that you can use that can enforce style guide consistency. I recommend, with style guides, I recommend not reinventing the wheel. I recommend getting John Cole's Global English Style Guide. Most tech writing teams use Chicago Manual of Style or Microsoft Manual of Style. So start with those, and then use a wiki or an intranet site to, I prefer a wiki because it's more editable, but get a team together and really go through that style guide and make it consistent and make it so that you're not only telling people what to do, but also what not to do. So for example, a lot of software teams like to use the term on the fly, which really means as you work. But when you go to localization, I've actually seen that translated into Spanish as en la mosca, which means literally on the fly that buzzes around, okay? So you need to get rid of those kinds of terms, but they need an alternative. What should they say instead, right? So I hope, that's a whole, that style guide conversation is a whole nother conversation as well. How can we suggest to our colleagues in engineering that they use consistent terms when identifying components? This is where terminology management really comes into play. Pulling yourself upstream in the design process helps. But when you point out that if you use an inconsistent term, one, it's confusing for the user. Two, it's confusing for the translator. And three, you're costing the company money when you do that. But this is why terminology management needs to be above the project level. It needs to be at the minimum at the program level, so that and preferably at the corporate level, so that you are being consistent in your use of terminology across your product lines, across your divisions. And, in some ways, I think taking the naming of things away from engineering might be the way to do it, although that might be a politically difficult thing to do depending on your status in the organization. But this is where having a content strategy, having a localization strategy, having terminology management really helps you. And you have to start somewhere, right? So start by pointing out all the places where you're being inconsistent, maybe doing an audit of your content to identify those issues with the consistency, and putting it in a spreadsheet, or, I mean, this is just a beginning thing. There are terminology management systems, but just to get the point across to the colleagues in engineering, and then work with your localization team to identify how all the different ways those things are translated and how you can make this more consistent. And you know, that's one way. How can I improve the quality of my source content if I already have it written up? That's more challenging because it's easier to write it right the first time than it is to retrofit it. But some of the things, and you need to think about how the cost benefit of doing this, right? Sometimes some companies find it easier to start with the new and then rework the old as they bring the new into it. Keep in mind that you will take a localization hit if you've already translated that content. However, improving the quality of your source content and improving will also improve the quality of your translation. So a couple things that I would do if you already have existing source content is go through, do a content audit, identify the top 10 issues that you're seeing with your content, and maybe talk to the tech support, maybe talk to some users and find out what their biggest pain points are and start there. It's really important to also know that this is an ongoing process. It is not a one-off thing. Now, the initial getting your content internationalized and getting it in better shape may be a little time consuming and stuff, but if you then start doing it right as you create more content, then it'll be less painful as time goes on, and it'll get better and better. So it's an ongoing, continuous improvement type thing. Excuse me. Are there any other questions, Aneta?
For today, I think that's all the questions that we have. So once again, Kit, thank you so much for the webinar today, and thank you to our audience for joining us and participating. And I hope that all your questions have been answered. If you do think of anything after this webinar, I'll be sending out an email with links to the recording and to Kit's slides. So I'll make sure I'll include Kit's details to get in contact with her. So feel free to reach out to myself or Kit then. So thank you guys, and have a lovely day.
Thanks everyone, those were great questions. Have a great day.
Thank you guys, bye-bye.